The hidden secrets of St. Mary Me never truly settle. When the sound of a bell echoed from an old manor, the entire village came to a standstill. Every heart had one question. Was this sound a revelation of a long-forgotten deadly tale, or the first sign of a new buried mistake? As a new investigation began, everyone held their silence, hiding secrets of their own that might never be uncovered. The Blue Wren Tea Room was a quaint but ever-watchful corner nestled at the heart of Elderwood, a place where the scent of steeped Earl Grey mingled with whispers more potent than the strongest brew, and every raised teacup masked a secret waiting to unravel. On a mist-laced morning, as a sleepy chill crept through the cobblestone streets, Miss Eliza Thornwell sat at her usual window-side table, wrapped in her familiar grey shawl, eyes calm but piercing, the kind that missed nothing. Beside her, Mrs. Adeline Brewer, ever animated and slightly breathless, leaned in close, her voice hushed and urgent. "They say Thomas Redgrave's planning something for this weekend, something grand," she murmured, stirring her tea more for drama than flavor. Eliza didn't react immediately, just blinked slowly before replying with that signature calm of hers. "Word is, he's to announce an engagement with Annabel Crowley." There was a pause between them, stretched tight with implication. "Clever girl, that one," Adeline said, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Too clever, perhaps. People talk, Eliza. Some say she's not marrying for love. Some say she's hunting for security." Eliza's gaze wandered past the glass, watching a few villagers shuffle past with purpose in their stride, and rumors on their lips. Inside, the air had turned denser, the quiet hum of the tea room vibrating with something deeper than idle gossip. "There's always talk, especially when money's thin and pride's thick," Eliza mused aloud, her voice soft but certain. "A manor like Redgrave doesn't come without a price, and I don't mean just financially." Just then, from a nearby table, a woman's voice rose, sharp and tinged with something bitter. "With debts like the Redgraves have, it's a wonder someone hasn't stepped in already, legally or otherwise." That sentence sliced through the genteel atmosphere like a knife, and Eliza's attention snapped toward the source, not with alarm, but with calculated interest. She filed it away, like a clue tucked into the sleeve of her mind. Elderwood was no stranger to facade. The village dressed in floral lanes and smiling neighbors, but underneath lay a network of ancient grudges, fragile alliances, and the kind of secrets that grew darker the longer they were buried. At the edge of the village, Redgrave Manor loomed, a fading grandeur wrapped in ivy and silence. That morning, it was anything but still. Servants darted about in barely contained panic, arms full of table linens and candlesticks, voices rising in chaotic chorus as preparations surged ahead. In the midst of it, Thomas Redgrave moved like a man battling a tide, clipboard in hand, his expression tight with tension poorly hidden beneath a strained smile. "Everything must be perfect," he kept muttering, as if perfection might pay off creditors or silence rumors. From the threshold of the drawing room, his elder sister Eleanor watched him with arms crossed and a brow raised. "Lavish, isn't it?" she called out sharply. "We don't have the fortune for royalty, Thomas." He didn't answer immediately. Then, forcing a placid grin, he replied, "It's all under control, Eleanor. We just need this to work." But the truth lay heavy in his voice. This wasn't about love. It was survival dressed in lace and champagne. Annabel Crowley arrived not long after, gliding into the manor like a gust of expensive perfume and calculated grace. Her smile was radiant, but her eyes were keen, scanning every surface, every reaction. She embraced Thomas with warmth, yet the set of her jaw betrayed something else. She was no fool, and she knew exactly what she was walking into. Their conversation, overheard by no one, was nothing more than pleasant exchanges, but the silence between their words echoed louder than any vow. Back at the tea room, as Eliza stood to leave, she turned once more to the murmuring crowd. The voices hadn't softened, they'd sharpened. Every sentence now felt like it carried weight, like the village itself had begun to sense the storm gathering over Redgrave. A party was being planned, yes, but something darker was unfolding beneath the garlands and champagne. Eliza didn't say it aloud, but she felt it in her bones. Someone was lying. And in Elderwood lies were like threads. Pull one, and the entire tapestry might unravel. This engagement was just the beginning. A game was in motion, and the stakes weren't just hearts, they were lives. Actors flawlessly embodied their roles, as if the entire evening had been rehearsed down to the last champagne bubble, the atmosphere within Ravenshade Hall glittering with curated charm and veiled tension. "Everything looks lovely, Charles," Lillian remarked, her voice smooth but cold, the kind that could both soothe and slice. "Only the best for you," Charles replied with a rehearsed smile, though his eyes betrayed him, flicking nervously across the grand hall as though the truth might leak from the gilded frames or whisper through the velvet drapes. And then right on cue, Beatrice Marchmont swept into the room, her entrance deliberate, her gown sharp and severe, and a bouquet in hand that looked more like a prop than a gift. She approached with brittle elegance, extending the flowers to Lillian, while her eyes lingered on Charles for just a fraction too long. "Congratulations, Lillian. Charles is quite the catch, isn't he?" Her tone oozed sweetness laced with venom. Lillian's nod was poised, her lips curved, but her eyes unreadable. "Thank you, Beatrice. We're both very lucky." But Beatrice's gaze clung to her a moment longer, heavy with the ghosts of things left unsaid. Across the room, hidden partly by a column, and wholly by bitterness, Daniel Everett, Lillian's estranged brother, seized a moment to confront her. "So marrying into fortune now. You've always reached for what wasn't yours," he hissed. Lillian's expression cracked for a heartbeat, her refined mask slipping to reveal something steel beneath. "Careful, Daniel," she murmured, her voice a warning dressed in silk. "I know more than you think." His hollow laugh echoed softly between them. "We'll see about that." The orchestra swelled in the distance, almost covering the rising tension as whispers slithered through the polished corridors and crystal-lit gardens. Outside, the estate gleamed like a storybook dream, fairy lights tangled in the trees, laughter litting from manicured hedges, and champagne fizzing like secrets just below the surface. Miss Mevan Whitlow stood apart from the crowd, her lemonade untouched, her gaze sharp and roving, capturing smiles too wide and laughter a shade too shrill. Ravenshade was a facade, one she knew how to read. And then came Inspector Lennox Vale, cutting through the garden like a storm in tailored grey, his presence shifting the mood with a ripple of restrained authority. Charles greeted him with a handshake too firm to be sincere. "Glad you could make it," he said, voice a notch too loud. "Wouldn't miss it," Vale replied, but his gaze was already sweeping the shadows like a man expecting the night to turn. Beatrice found her moment again, gliding toward Charles with the determination of someone with unfinished business. "So poetic. This whole affair," she murmured, the sarcasm in her voice drawing nearby attention. Charles smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Beatrice, always a pleasure," he said, excusing himself like a man retreating from a battlefield. Miss Whitlow's eyes followed the exchange with clinical interest. Beatrice's anger wasn't simple heartbreak. It had the sting of betrayal, of secrets traded and never forgotten. In Ravenshade, betrayal wasn't rare, it was currency. As the party spun on in a glittering illusion of joy, Miss Whitlow's mind ticked on like clockwork, mapping glances and silences, alliances and threats. The manor may have glittered with the glow of 1920s luxury, but beneath its polished surface, every guest was a pawn, every compliment a calculation, and every step danced to the rhythm of something darker brewing. Somewhere in the distance, a scream would eventually cut through the night, and the real performance would begin. Beneath a bruised twilight sky, where lanterns swayed like secrets in the breath of the wind, the gardens of Ravenshade Hall whispered with things better left unsaid. Every leaf held its silence like a vow, and every flicker of light trembled as though aware of the darkness it dared to keep at bay. The air, thick with the scent of roses and damp earth, seemed to breathe with a life of its own, as though it too were a witness to the secrets that stirred in the shadows. Among the laughter and soft clinks of crystal, Elira Greystone moved with the grace of a woman perfectly composed, her every step a carefully measured performance. Yet beneath her serene smile, simmered a storm known only to her, a storm that she had long ago learned to mask with practiced ease. The engagement of Vincent Langford, heir to a crumbling empire of shadowy fortune, to the enigmatic heiress Seraphina Vale, had drawn out every name that mattered in polite society, and a few that lurked in its margins, just beyond the gleam of wealth and privilege. As Vincent raised a golden flute in toast beneath the shimmer of chandeliers suspended from age-old elms, the guests leaned in, captivated by the spectacle. A hush fell over the gathering, thick and expectant. His voice, smooth and practiced, floated above the murmurs, but there was an edge to it, an urgency that bled through the veneer of politeness. "Seraphina, will you make me the happiest man alive?" he asked, the words slipping off his tongue like a rehearsed line, yet laden with an intensity that made the crowd hold its breath. Seraphina stood before him, her gaze unwavering, her lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile, a smile that radiated an unsettling calm. Her response, soft and measured, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. "Yes, Vincent, I will," she said, her voice clear, yet there was something in her eyes, something that flickered and disappeared too quickly for anyone to truly see. The applause erupted, hearty and unrestrained, but to Alira's discerning eyes, it was a hollow sound, a chorus of rehearsed joy, masking the undercurrents of tension that swirled just beneath the surface. Alira's gaze swept over the crowd, taking in every detail, the tightness of Aunt Cressida's jaw, the barely controlled fury in Malcolm Wren's eyes, and the subtle retreat of Aldrich Kane, the family solicitor, who slipped away into the manor, with the grace of a man who had long ago perfected the art of remaining unnoticed. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment with mechanical precision, their lenses oblivious to the deeper currents stirring just beyond the reach of the lens. Minutes passed, but the air seemed to grow thicker, the atmosphere shifting as the night wore on. Whispers grew louder as the guests trickled away, some in twos, others in quiet clusters, exchanging glances that spoke of far more than the night's festivities. Vincent and Seraphina, now officially engaged, stood apart from the others, their conversation hushed and intense. Alira lingered in the shadows, unseen but keenly aware of the tension that crackled between them. "You've played your part brilliantly, Seraphina," Vincent hissed, his voice low, but there was a tremor beneath the surface, a tremor that was not born of affection. "But remember, this is just the beginning." Seraphina's response was as cold as winter's first breath, her smile fading into something far more calculating, a mask of politeness barely hiding the steel beneath. "Then pray I don't come to understand everything, Vincent. For your sake," she replied, her words sharp as a blade hidden beneath velvet. With that she turned on her heel, her gown sweeping the floor like the trailing edges of a storm, and disappeared into the darkened halls of the manor, her figure swallowed by the night. Alira watched her go, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. There was more to this engagement than met the eye, more to Vincent and Seraphina than the charming facades they wore. As the party wound down and the guests dispersed, Alira followed in their wake, moving with quiet purpose toward the manor. She knew, deep in her bones, that the night was far from over, and that whatever had been set into motion here, beneath the veneer of civility, was bound to unravel with devastating consequences. The silence inside the manor was oppressive, broken only by the distant murmur of the wind outside. Alira made her way through the darkened halls, her steps muffled by the plush carpet beneath her feet. There was a chill in the air, a sense of foreboding that clung to the manor like the mist on the moors. The hallway she entered was dimly lit, the faint glow of a single candle casting long shadows that danced eerily on the walls. The sound of her footsteps seemed to echo too loudly in the emptiness. She moved forward, each step taking her deeper into the heart of the house, closer to whatever secret it was hiding. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the mist, a scream shattered the quiet, a scream so raw and filled with terror that it seemed to freeze the very air in its wake. Alira rushed toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. A maid stood trembling outside the drawing room, her face ashen, her hands trembling as she knocked urgently on the door. Alira arrived just as Vincent, his hair disheveled, and his suit crumpled from a night spent awake with dread, tore open the door with a frantic urgency. The scene inside the room was stark, a jarring contrast to the chaos of the night before. Serafina lay draped across a velvet settee, her posture unnervingly serene, her gown unwrinkled, as though she had simply fallen asleep. But there was an unnatural stillness to her form, an absence that filled the room with a sense of dread. Her skin was too pale, her lips too red, and the faintest hint of a smile twisted her features in a grotesque parody of peace. Beside her, a goblet lay on its side, its contents spilled in a dark pool that stained the rug beneath her. But it was the note, torn in two, that caught Illyra's attention. Scrawled in a hand that was familiar yet distorted by haste, the message sent a chill down her spine. "You lied. I know what was done beneath the house." The words were simple, but their meaning was anything but. In Ravenshade Hall, engagements were never simple affairs. They were often the beginning of darker games. Games played in the shadows, where the stakes were life and death, and where no one was ever truly safe. As Illyra stood in the doorway, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just uncovered, she knew this was only the beginning. Whatever had been set into motion here would unfold in ways none of them could predict, and it would not stop until every secret had been laid bare. The manor stood as a silent witness to the unraveling of yet another dark mystery, its weathered walls soaked with the weight of secrets long buried. The room, bathed in the soft glow of the morning light filtering through the heavy curtains, was disturbingly still. The windows had been securely locked from the inside, every inch of the space untouched, as though time had momentarily paused, leaving no trace of the tragic event that had occurred there. The only sign of disruption was the faint smell of tobacco and old paper mingling with the unmistakable scent of champagne that lingered in the air. Inspector Harrow's car crunched the gravel as it approached Whitaker Manor, its tires grinding against the pebbles in a rhythm that seemed too loud for the morning stillness. His arrival was swift, his face a mask of grim determination, as if the weight of countless similar cases had already etched itself into his every feature. Mrs. Marnell, breathless from delivering the news, had already ensured that Miss Marple was at the scene, her quiet presence a stark contrast to the growing tension in the air. As Harrow entered the library, his trained gaze swept over the scene with the precision of a man who had seen far too much. The glass of champagne, half empty, the untouched room, and the lifeless form of Lillian Whitaker, draped across the chair in a grotesque semblance of peace, were the only things that marked the end of the evening's festivity. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Harrow muttered the details into his worn notebook, his mind racing, but it was the note left beside Lillian, scratched hastily on a crumpled scrap of paper, that caught his attention. Blackmail, he thought. But was it really that simple? Miss Marple, always observant, had remained silent by the doorway, her eyes sharp, noting every detail, every shift in the room's atmosphere. It wasn't until Harold Langston, the family solicitor, entered the room that the tension broke, if only for a moment. His usual composure seemed to crumble as his eyes darted uneasily from the glass to the note, his voice a nervous murmur. "Distressing, most distressing," he said, though it was unclear whether he referred to Lillian's tragic death, or the implications of what had been left behind. It was Miss Marple who finally spoke, her voice cutting through the heavy air with the ease of a practiced observer. "Isn't it odd," she mused, "that Lillian would drink alone after such a public event, to seek solitude with a glass of champagne, especially when one is supposed to be celebrating?" Her words hung in the air, their implications heavier than the stillness of the room. Harrow's gaze lingered on the glass, and his thoughts began to piece together the fragments of the mystery. "You suggest she wasn't alone, then?" he asked, the question tentative but firm. Miss Marple, her eyes fixed on the half-empty glass, offered a soft reply. "Or that she didn't pour the drink herself." Her words, like a subtle suggestion of a hidden truth, seemed to weigh down the room even further. Harrow's mind raced as he took in the details. The locked windows, the untouched room, and Lillian, who appeared to have simply drifted into an eternal sleep. The paradox was too strong to ignore. Nothing had been disturbed, Yet everything felt off. Outside the distant birds sang. But inside the manor, the silence was suffocating, like a slow-moving storm gathering force. Miss Marple knew all too well that beneath the calm veneer of village life, there lurked shadows far darker than any of the townsfolk would ever dare to acknowledge. Her mind worked tirelessly through the web of greed, jealousy, and betrayal, pulling at the threads to unravel what had truly transpired. Meanwhile, the manor itself seemed to grow colder, the walls closer, as though the house itself was bracing for what was to come. When the interviews began, the tension was palpable. Harrow's notebook was open, his pen poised, ready to sift through the layers of truth and lies. Charles Whittaker, sitting across from him, seemed anything but composed. His eyes were rimmed with red, his nervous glances betraying him even as he claimed to have been asleep when the maid screamed. "I didn't hear anything, until she screamed," he insisted, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. Harrow's sharp gaze never left him. "And you were alone, Mr. Whittaker?" he asked. Charles's irritation was quick to surface, but it was overshadowed by something darker, a flicker of fear that briefly passed through his eyes. "Yes," he replied curtly, trying to maintain the facade of sorrow. But Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, noted the tremor in his hands. Remorse, or was it fear of being discovered? Margaret Whittaker, his sister, presented a different picture altogether. She was composed, almost too perfect, her story of wandering the gardens alone during the night's celebration seemingly innocent. But as Harrow probed further, her thinly veiled discomfort was impossible to miss. It was too much. The noise, the people. "I needed solitude," she explained, her voice firm but with an edge of defensiveness. Harrow raised an eyebrow, his pen poised in the air. "A solitary walk during your brother's engagement party," he remarked dryly, his voice laced with skepticism. Margaret's lips thinned, and for a moment her cool composure slipped. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in the corner, observed closely. When the time of death was mentioned, rumored to coincide with Margaret's solitary walk, a slight clench of her jaw did not go unnoticed. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but they painted a picture far murkier than anyone in the room could have imagined. The shadows grew longer as the clock ticked forward, and the room seemed to close in, each interview a delicate dance between truth and deception. As the day wore on, the pieces of the puzzle continued to shift, and Miss Marple's mind worked overtime to decipher the tangled web of motives, each thread more dangerous than the last. The final answer, she knew, was hidden just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The question was, who would unravel the truth first, and what would the consequences be when the secrets of Whittaker Manor were finally exposed? The mansion's quiet was deceptive, an unsettling calm hanging in the air like an ancient fog that refused to lift. Every corner of Whittaker Manor whispered secrets, its walls groaning with the weight of untold stories. Inspector Harrow's boots clicked sharply on the gravel as his car neared the estate, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent grounds. He wasn't new to this. The familiar unease of tragedy clinging to the air had marked too many mornings just like this one. As he entered the library, the scent of aged leather and tobacco mingled with something sharper, something that screamed of violence in the calmest of settings. The locked windows, the untouched room, the glass of champagne still sitting by the body of Lillian Whittaker. It was all wrong. Inspector Harrow's eyes, weary and seasoned, studied every detail. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was missing from the scene. As Miss Marple observed from the doorway, her presence quiet yet magnetic, the pieces began to fall into place. A locked room, a woman alone, and a drink that wasn't poured by her own hand, she mused, her voice carrying an eerie calm. Harrow turned to her, brow furrowing. "You think she wasn't alone then?" he asked, the weight of her words slowly sinking in. Miss Marple's eyes flickered over the glass, her fingers drumming lightly on her knitting needles. "I believe she didn't drink that alone, and I believe the truth is hiding just beneath the surface of this perfectly staged scene," she replied, her gaze piercing through the haze of assumptions that clouded Harrow's mind. Outside, the village of St. Mary's continued its day, unaware of the storm brewing within the manor. Inside, however, every word spoken seemed to add a new layer of tension, each conversation more cryptic than the last. When Charles Whittaker was questioned, his answers were too smooth, too rehearsed. "I was asleep," he insisted, but the redness around his eyes betrayed the lie. His discomfort at being scrutinized was palpable, but Harrow wasn't convinced. His instinct told him something wasn't right. Margaret, his sister, had her own version of events, claiming she was alone, wandering the gardens. Her calm exterior was a stark contrast to the rumblings beneath the surface, but Miss Marple's sharp eye caught the subtle twitch of her jaw when the subject of time came up. Then there was Beatrice Marmont, who with a biting tone denied any real connection to the tragedy. Yet her avoidance of mentioning the missing sapphire wasn't lost on Harrow. But it was Daniel Everett, with his raw, unfiltered anger, who dropped the most significant clue. Charles wanted control, he spat. And Lillian knew too much. She found out about the sapphire, and that's what got her killed. Miss Marple's ears pricked up at the mention of the sapphire. As the interviews unfolded, another unsettling truth emerged. Harold Langston, the family solicitor, had been more involved than he let on. His reaction to the mention of the Whittaker sapphire was not one of surprise but panic, sweat beading on his forehead as he stumbled over his words. Miss Marple's gaze narrowed. "An interesting reaction," she mused aloud. "One that speaks volumes about your knowledge of what's missing." The inspector, following the thread of suspicion, took the investigation deeper, into the cold, damp vault beneath the manor, where rows of empty shelves greeted them like ghosts of the past. Langston's shaky confession about retrieving legal documents for Charles under pressure raised more questions than it answered. Charles, in turn, denied any knowledge of the request, his face flushed with an emotion that seemed to be more fear than anger. The tension in the room thickened, as Miss Marple, ever the observer, casually inquired about Langston's briefcase, a detail that set off a cascade of doubts. Langston's too quick dismissal, and his flustered response only heightened suspicion. As the puzzle pieces slowly clicked together, it became clear that the key to Lillian's death was not merely a personal vendetta, but something far more insidious, a tangled web of greed, fear, and deception, and the lost sapphire at its center. Miss Marple, with her sharp intuition and patient unraveling of the clues, watched as Harrow pieced together the truth, all while the quiet of the manor threatened to break under the weight of its many secrets. The air around Whittaker Manor had become thick with tension, each passing moment deepening the mystery that clung to the walls like an insidious fog. As the investigation unfolded, the weight of every revelation pressed upon those involved, tightening the noose of suspicion around the manor's inhabitants. Inspector Harrow stood still, his sharp eyes catching every detail, but it was Miss Marple, ever the astute observer, who sensed the subtle shifts beneath the surface, the quiet tremors of unease that no one could escape. Every new piece of the puzzle added complexity, unraveling the calm exterior of Whittaker Manor, and exposing the cracks beneath. The photographs, now developed in the dim light of the manor's darkroom, told a story that words could not capture. Each image, though frozen in time, seemed to pulse with secrets, revealing more than just the smiling faces of partygoers in their festive garb. One particular photograph seized their attention, a snapshot of Margaret, dressed in her flowing evening gown, lingering by the library's partially open door. The timestamp on the photo placed her there mere minutes before Lillian's estimated time of death. Her calm explanation of merely seeking fresh air now felt hollow, her words betraying her as her fingers twisted a handkerchief into an ever-tightening knot, revealing a nervous energy that even she could not control. The slight shift in her gaze as she spoke, a look toward the window that seemed to yearn for escape, only deepened the suspicion that hung in the air like a cloud of impending storm. And then there was Harold, his composed exterior crumbling when the photograph of him slipping through the manor's side entrance was presented. His earlier claim of simply stepping out into the garden now seemed laughable, a feeble excuse that fell apart under the scrutiny of visual evidence. His stammered explanation, "I needed to fetch some documents from my briefcase in the office," was a transparent lie that did little to convince anyone. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by the fragile facade of a man caught in a lie, one that was rapidly unraveling before his very eyes. But it was Beatrice who provided the most chilling revelation. When Miss Marple and Harrow visited her cottage on a hunch, they arrived just in time to witness her tossing fragments of a burnt note into the fireplace, the charred remnants revealing hints of a secret she desperately wanted to keep hidden. Beatrice's aristocratic features hardened, her eyes flashing with indignation as she denied any involvement. "Lillian was always one to make a drama out of nothing," she declared, her voice dismissive, but her nervous gaze flickered toward the mantel where the note had once been displayed, betraying her calm demeanor. Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, noted the subtle shifts in Beatrice's composure, the tightness of her jaw, the shift in her eyes, and knew that there was much more to the story than the lady was willing to admit. As they left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind churned with the weight of these revelations. People often claim they want no part in the drama, yet they cannot help but play their roles on the stage, she mused aloud, her voice soft but laden with truth. Her words hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, each one carrying a deeper meaning that Miss Marple knew would soon come to light. The puzzle pieces were fitting together, but the final picture was still clouded in shadows, waiting to be illuminated by the truth. Back at the station, Harrow and Miss Marple lined up the photographs on the pinboard, each one representing a piece of the mystery, each telling a story of deceit, manipulation, and hidden motives. The weight of the evidence was palpable, pressing down on everyone involved, suffocating them with the inevitability of the truth's revelation. The quiet village of St. Mary Me, so accustomed to peaceful rhythms, had become a simmering cauldron of suspicion. Behind closed doors, the residents whispered to one another, their voices tinged with fear and uncertainty. Who could they trust? Who would crack under the pressure? The shadows of Whittaker Manor stretched long, casting their darkness over the village, and Miss Marple knew that the walls would soon come crashing down, exposing the lies that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. The final crack in the case came unexpectedly, in a seemingly innocent comment from Mrs. Brenner, the longtime housekeeper. She mentioned the strange creaks in the walls, more frequent than usual since the night of the party. The casual remark, spoken off-handedly as she dusted the portraits in the hallway, sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. The house, once merely a backdrop to the unfolding mystery, had now become a participant in its own right, its creaks and groans revealing secrets that had long been buried in the floorboards. Was it merely the house settling, or was it something more, something darker? Inside Whittaker Manor, the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the ancient windows, seemed to speak of long-buried secrets, of lives twisted by lies, of actions taken in the dead of night. The manor, like its inhabitants, was hiding something that could tear the quiet village of St. Mary Me apart if it were ever revealed. And as Miss Marple stood at the threshold of the manor, she knew that the web of deceit was finally beginning to unravel, one thread at a time. Each secret, each lie, would soon be exposed, and the truth that lay hidden beneath would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew. Whittaker Manor stood ominously, its ancient walls harboring secrets buried deep within their creaking beams. It had been a place of quiet sophistication, until the night Lillian's body was found in the library. Inspector Harrow had been meticulous in his questioning, but it was Miss Marple's intuition that had begun to see through the fog of lies that surrounded the manor's inhabitants. Every whisper, every nervous glance was a clue, and though they were subtle, they painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated tragedy. The housekeeper's comment about the strange creaks within the manor had not gone unnoticed. Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, had latched onto it with unusual interest. After thanking the housekeeper with her customary politeness, she quietly excused herself and wandered towards the kitchen, her footsteps silent on the polished floors. The old servant passages, long forgotten and untouched by time, beckoned her curiosity. These hidden corridors had once allowed the servants to move discreetly throughout the manor, unnoticed by the household. Tucked beyond the kitchen's fragrant bustle, she found what she sought, the disused dumbwaiter, its wood panels weathered by years of neglect. The shaft above led directly to the library, the very room where Lillian had been found. With careful hands, Miss Marple tugged at the frayed ropes, the mechanism groaning in protest, but yielding, allowing the small platform to descend slowly, its journey marked by the soft creak of wood against time's toll. With a practiced grace, Miss Marple stepped inside the cramped elevator, her movements betraying none of her age, and descended to the library's level. The space was tight, the air thick with the musty scent of forgotten years, but it worked, and she arrived at the library entrance undetected. A subtle smile tugged at her lips as she realized the implication. This hidden passage could have easily been used to commit the murder and escape without a soul ever knowing. Climbing out of the dumbwaiter, her mind raced through the possibility. The family's stories, so carefully woven to avoid suspicion, were beginning to unravel, each new detail revealing a web of deceit. The housekeeper's words now made sense. The creaks she had heard were likely the sounds of the dumbwaiter's ropes, groaning under the weight of its hidden passengers. Miss Marple's mind moved quickly, connecting the dots between Harold's evasive behavior, Margaret's nervous fidgeting, and the family's inconsistent alibis. All these pieces fell into place with startling clarity. The discovery of the dumbwaiter had solved one puzzle, the method of escape. But now, the real question loomed large: who had the knowledge to use it, and why? With a purposeful step, Miss Marple rejoined Inspector Harrow, her mind alight with the breakthrough they had been waiting for. But as she shared her findings, she knew this was only the beginning. The final act of the mystery was yet to unfold, and she was ready to unveil the devastating truth. Later, as the day's light faded into the evening shadows, Miss Marple found herself alone in Harold Langston's office, surrounded by the disorganized clutter of legal papers and files that spoke of a life lived in secrets. Her eyes fell upon a small ink bottle on his desk, its label worn, but the deep rich blue ink inside unmistakable. She picked it up with the utmost care, inspecting the shade as though it held the key to unlocking the truth. "This is quite an unusual color, Mr. Langston," she remarked, her voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of sharp curiosity. Harold's face drained of color, and his eyes flickered with a momentary panic before he masked it with a strained smile. "It's a special order," he said, his voice brittle. "I use it for sensitive documents." Miss Marple's gaze met his sharp and unwavering. "A shade not commonly found in ordinary stationery shops, I imagine," she prompted gently. The tension in the room thickened. Harold's defense crumbled under the weight of her words. His voice faltered as he began. "It was all supposed to be a distraction. The proposal party. I suggested it to Charles. It was the perfect cover to replace some documents that would have implicated me in embezzlement, and the sapphire." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, urging him to continue. "But then Lillian, she found out. Somehow she discovered everything and confronted me. She demanded a share of it, threatened to go to Charles or the police." Harold's voice trailed off, his defiance all but gone. The room seemed to close in around him as the truth spilled out like ink from a broken pen. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind piecing together every thread of the story. There it was. The motive. A desperate man cornered by his own secrets, willing to do anything to protect them. The murder, the cover-up, the missing documents. It all fit now. But there was more to uncover. More shadows lurking in the corners of Whittaker Manor. The full truth had yet to reveal itself, and Miss Marple, ever the patient detective, knew that the final revelation would be even darker than they could imagine. The quiet manor, once a place of elegance, had become the stage for a tragedy far more sinister than anyone had anticipated. And Miss Marple was the only one who could bring it all to light. The manor, heavy with secrets and the weight of years, had always whispered its mysteries through the creaks and groans of its timbers. But today it spoke in a far darker tongue. Miss Marple, sharp as ever, had followed the faintest trail of clues, each one leading her further into the tangled webs, spun by ambition and greed. Her conversation with Harold had left a lingering tension in the air, the truth, while yet unspoken, hanging over them like a suffocating fog. Harold's confession, a raw admission of panic and regret, barely scratched the surface of the depths to which he had sunk. "I thought I could control it," he had said, his voice trembling. But Miss Marple's keen eyes had already seen through the veil of his excuses, recognizing the fear that had pushed him to murder. The dumbwaiter, hidden away in the forgotten servants' passage, had been the perfect means of escape, a silent route from crime to cover-up. But it was not just the mechanics of the manor that had conspired to conceal a death. It was the deliberate choices of a man who believed he could escape the consequences of his actions. The dull glint of the Whittaker sapphire, half hidden beneath Harold's clutter, caught Miss Marple's gaze as she left his office, a reminder of the riches that had driven him to the edge of madness. As the police led Harold away in handcuffs, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Miss Marple could feel the cold satisfaction of a puzzle finally falling into place. But for all the clarity, there was no sense of triumph, only the quiet, solemn understanding that in every story of betrayal, there was always more lurking in the shadows. Outside, St. Mary Me seemed unchanged, the village's rhythm unbroken, but beneath the surface, a shift had occurred, an unsettling reminder that no secret remained hidden forever. Inspector Harrow's quiet resignation as he bade her farewell only added to the air of finality that had settled over the case. His departure, like the fading of an old familiar shadow, marked the end of an era for the village's law enforcement. Yet even as Miss Marple sat in the quiet comfort of her tea shop, her mind remained focused on the invisible undercurrents of human nature that had led to this dark conclusion. Villages like St. Mary Me, with their quaint facades, often mask the most treacherous currents beneath, and today, those currents had come to light. The tea in her cup had cooled, but the bitter aftertaste of the truth lingered. Lies, she mused aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, are always the brightest before they're exposed. In the end, the satisfaction of justice was not enough to quell the unease that always followed such revelations. The village would return to its quiet pace, the whispers would fade, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the calm, the roots of envy, fear and greed had only grown deeper. And so, the mysteries of the world, much like the truths uncovered today, would remain hidden in plain sight, forever waiting for the right observer to see through the veneer, and expose the darkness that always lurked just beneath the surface. The market square of St. Mary Me had transformed, no longer a serene gathering place for morning gossip, but a buzzing cauldron of suspicion and wild theories, the reverberations of Harold Langston's arrest and Lillian Everett's murder having sent ripples of chaos through the village. The usual chatter had given way to intense whispers, sharp accusations, and furtive glances, as though everyone in the village had become an unintentional detective, convinced they held the missing piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, stood near the village fountain, her keen eyes taking in every detail, every small shift in the behavior of the villagers around her. Mrs. Harrell, holding a loaf of bread like a scepter, declared loudly, her voice quivering with conviction, "Harold Langston couldn't have acted alone. Someone else is pulling the strings. Someone cleverer. Someone hiding in plain sight." Miss Marple merely hummed, the noise almost imperceptible, her mind already turning over Mrs. Harrell's words. Yes, the case was not as simple as it appeared, and there were more layers to peel back before the truth could be revealed. Her gaze drifted to the heated argument unfolding at the bakery. Beatrix Marchmont, her face flushed and her fists clenched, was in the middle of an animated quarrel with Margaret Whittaker, their words sharp, their tones bitter. The words hung heavy in the air, dripping with long-held resentment, Beatrix accusing Margaret of reckless pursuit of her brother, and Margaret retorting with venom, reminding Beatrix of her own role in the unfolding scandal. As the villagers gathered, watching the scene with varying degrees of discomfort, Miss Marple observed the underlying currents of pain, guilt, and regret that coursed through the confrontation. Knowing this spat was far more than just a public row. It was the eruption of years of repressed feelings, the surface finally breaking. Her attention was drawn next to Charles Whittaker, who moved through the square like a ghost of his former self, his face ashen, his eyes avoiding the gazes of those around him. His posture, hunched and defeated, betrayed more than just the burden of scandal. It was the weight of unspoken knowledge, a secret wrapped in guilt that threatened to consume him. As the villagers' conversations faded into the background, Miss Marple's mind worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of the tangled web of secrets and lies that had ensnared the Whittaker family. This was no simple case of murder. It was a game of shadows and mirrors, where every player had their own hidden agenda. With deliberate steps, Miss Marple left the square, her thoughts deep and filled with a quiet intensity. She knew the facade of tranquility in St. Mary Me was an illusion, masking the dark undercurrents that pulsed beneath the surface. She had peeled back many such facades in her time, and this would not be the first. With a final glance at the market square, she turned towards Whittaker Manor, its imposing silhouette looming ahead, a stark reminder of the dark truths it held within. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Margaret Whittaker, no longer the poised socialite, but a woman weighed down by suspicion and fear, greeted Miss Marple in the cold, cavernous hall, her smile tight, eyes darting nervously as if expecting the worst. "You've come to finish what you started then." Margaret's voice wavered, but there was a certain resolve in her demeanor as she led Miss Marple into the drawing room. As the door closed behind them, the silence in the room was palpable, and Miss Marple knew the answers she sought lay hidden somewhere in this web of deception. She had come to unearth the truth, no matter how buried it was beneath the lies. The soft clink of china echoed in the quiet room, the last of the tea poured with deliberate slowness into delicate cups, the steaming liquid swirling within as though carrying with it the weight of unspoken thoughts. Margaret's hands, though composed outwardly, trembled ever so slightly as she grasped her teacup, the fine porcelain rattling faintly under her fingertips. It was a subtle gesture, yet one that spoke volumes about the unease stirring deep within her. Her voice, typically steady and commanding, faltered ever so slightly as she spoke, the tension in her words impossible to hide. "Harold's been caught, yes," she began, a forced calmness in her tone. "But something doesn't sit right. He was greedy, undeniably so, but a murderer. That doesn't make sense. I've known him for years. He was always more coward than killer." Her gaze flitted nervously to the edges of the teacup, her fingers absently tracing the rim, as if the cup itself could offer some comfort against the swirling doubts in her mind. Miss Marple, who had been listening closely with her sharp eyes and quiet attention, nodded ever so slightly, her gaze flickering over Margaret's anxious form before she spoke, her voice soft but measured. "Fear," Miss Marple mused, "can drive even the most reluctant of men to extremes, pushing them to do things they themselves would never have thought possible." She placed her cup gently back onto its saucer, the clink of porcelain sharp in the stillness. "But we mustn't assume that all the threads are neatly tied, my dear. Not just yet." With Margaret's reluctant permission, Miss Marple rose from her chair and wandered the grand yet eerily silent halls of Whittaker Manor, her footsteps measured and deliberate, her keen eyes absorbing every detail of the manor's once stately surroundings. There was something about the place, something unsettling in its stillness, a sense that the manor itself was holding its breath, as though it knew the secrets it harbored could soon be exposed. Passing the library, Miss Marple's gaze was drawn to a small but telling detail: fresh scratches on the polished wood near the dumbwaiter entrance. Their edges were sharp, almost too fresh to be ignored, and they spoke of hurried, perhaps frantic, use. That alone sent a shiver of suspicion coursing through her. The manor's secrets, she knew, were far from over. As she moved deeper into the heart of the manor, Miss Marple made her way to Charles Whittaker's study. The air in the room was thick with the scent of leather-bound books, and the faint tang of despair, the papers scattered across the desk a testament to the chaos that had long permeated the family's affairs. It was there, amidst the disarray, that her eyes landed on a particular folder, marked private in bold, urgent letters. Opening it with careful precision, she uncovered a series of documents detailing offshore accounts, cryptic financial transactions, and notes that spoke in hushed terms of monetary distress, far greater than the Whittakers had ever publicly admitted. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. The Whittaker family, so proud and so public in their opulence, had been hiding a darker truth, one tangled in greed, desperation, and secrets far worse than anything anyone had ever imagined. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, and as Miss Marple stepped back from the desk, her mind was already racing through the implications of what she had discovered. The manor, with its grand portraits and looming shadows, suddenly felt less like a place of dignity, and more like a gilded cage, a trap of its own making, a place where even the finest walls could not hide the truth forever. When Miss Marple exited the study, her eyes lingered on the stained glass windows, the fading light casting colorful patterns on the floor below, as if the house itself was trapped in a moment of glory that had long passed. The manor was a monument to its own past, and it was in its corridors of forgotten grandeur that the truth waited, quiet, elusive, yet undeniable. Stepping back into the gathering dusk, her mind already turned to the next phase of her investigation. Miss Marple headed to the village inn, a cozy, familiar refuge from the storm. The warmth of the fire and the buzz of locals gathered for their evening pint contrasted sharply with the cold reality she had just uncovered. As she entered, she spotted Inspector Harrow, his usual stoic demeanor giving way to something less certain. A pint of ale sat untouched before him, and his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt as he glanced up at Miss Marple's arrival. "Harold's confession," he began, his voice low and guarded. "It's neat, isn't it? Tidy. But it doesn't sit right with me." He admitted everything too easily, almost like he was covering for someone. "It feels too convenient." Miss Marple sat opposite him, her posture relaxed, yet her mind already turning over the facts. "The easiest answer is often the one that comforts us the most," she said softly, her voice measured. "But we must not mistake convenience for truth. Harold was many things, but a killer, that's something different." She let the words linger, her eyes narrowing slightly as she thought further. "And then there's the matter of the foxglove," she continued, her fingers absently smoothing the crease of her skirt. "It's common enough here in the gardens. No need for secrecy to acquire it." Harrow's gaze sharpened at her words, as though a light had suddenly clicked on in his mind. "Exactly," he said, his tone more urgent now. "Anyone could have gotten their hands on it. And yet Harold took the blame. All of it. Pointed no fingers at anyone else." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes distant as she considered the implications of that. "It is indeed strange," she murmured. "And there's Beatrice." She paused, her mind racing back to the earlier scenes, her reaction to Lillian's death. It was more than just a jilted lover's distress. There was more behind it. Something deeper. Harrow furrowed his brow, his mind turning over her words. If Harold wasn't working alone, the implication hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The truth was out there, but Miss Marple knew that untangling it would take more than just a sharp mind. It would take patience, persistence, and the right push at just the right moment. As the fire crackled behind them, the two of them sat, lost in thought, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to come together. The manor had secrets, and they were about to be exposed. The amber glow of the last light of day seeped through the crack in the curtain, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The scent of freshly brewed tea hung in the air, mixing with the heavier undertones of something darker, an unspoken tension that refused to dissipate. Inspector Harrow's gaze lingered on his glass of ale, the bitter liquid swirling lazily, as if trying to wash away the knot of uncertainty tightening in his chest. A sip, a brief pause, and then a quiet, deliberate voice broke the silence. "The question remains, Miss Marple," he said, his words heavy with the weight of something unsaid. "Who else stood to gain from Lillian's silence? Harold might be guilty, but there's more here than a simple confession." Miss Marple, as always, remained composed, her thoughtful expression unwavering as she allowed the evening's final slivers of light to dance across her face. "Indeed, Inspector, that is the question," she replied, her voice soft but resolute, "and in answering it, we may unravel something far more insidious than mere complicity in theft." Her words hung in the air, dense and laden with mystery. The room around them was alive with the hum of distant conversations, but it all seemed a world away, the whispers of the village providing little comfort in the wake of the darkness closing in. Miss Marple's mind churned through the possibilities, each more dangerous and elusive than the last. She knew this village, knew its hidden corners, and half-shared secrets better than anyone. But the Whittaker family, with all their carefully cultivated illusions, had woven a web so intricate, so deceitful, that even she couldn't yet see its full shape. As Harrow rose to leave, His eyes met hers with a newfound respect, something unspoken passing between them. "I've always valued your insight, Miss Marple," he said, his tone laced with an unusual sincerity. "This village could certainly use your keen observation now more than ever." She smiled, though the glint in her eye was one of quiet determination. "Thank you, Inspector. Together I believe we can untangle these threads. After all," she added with a wry smile, "every knot has its loose end." The night was fully upon them now, the village cloaked in the stillness of impending revelations. Outside, the shadows stretched like dark fingers across the cobbled streets of St. Mary Me, the church's ancient stone walls looming as silent witnesses to a truth that had long been buried. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she made her way to the church, where the secrets of the past were waiting to be unearthed. Reverend Granger, with his deeply furrowed brow and cautious gaze, seemed an unlikely keeper of such knowledge. But she knew better than to judge a book by its cover. With a polite request and a practiced smile, she gained access to the archives, the musty air thick with history as they pored over records, each dusty page turning like the winding of a clock, its ticking echoing louder in Miss Marple's mind. "Reverend," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "was there not a scandal involving the Whitakers some years ago? Something involving a young servant girl named Emily?" Reverend Granger's sigh was heavy with the weight of long-held secrets, his eyes betraying a reluctance to relive the past. "Yes," he muttered, his voice tight. "Emily. She claimed Charles Whitaker was the father of her child. The affair was a scandal, but the family wanted it hushed up. Harold Langston, he managed the matter, paid off the girl, kept it quiet. It was all settled behind closed doors." Miss Marple's thoughts swirled, the implications of what she had just learned settling like a weight in her stomach. Harold had always been the family's protector of secrets, a man who had brokered silence for the Whitakers at any cost. As she left the church, her mind raced with this new piece of the puzzle, the delicate threads of the Whitaker family's history tangling further and further into something far darker. She made her way to the estate, the overgrown gardens once proud and meticulously kept now wild with neglect, the foxglove plants thriving unchecked. Their beauty was deceptive, deadly in their perfection, much like the family who had once tended them. As she walked, she overheard the gardener speaking to a helper. "Funny thing," he said, with a shrug. "Those plants were nearly pulled up last week. Someone changed their mind, I suppose." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened as she considered the foxglove, its lethal nature hidden beneath the charm of its vibrant blooms. Murder could so easily be concealed within the simplest of things. It was then that Margaret Whitaker appeared, her pale face ghostly against the lush backdrop of the garden. Her steps faltered when she saw Miss Marple, and she quickly approached with an expression that barely masked her discomfort. "Miss Marple," Margaret said, her voice strained, "I've been meaning to clear out some of those old plants. Nasty things. Really. Poisonous. But they remain." Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the tension in her posture, the flush creeping up her neck. "Perhaps it is not always our intentions that matter," Miss Marple replied gently, "but how others perceive them. Sometimes we protect not just ourselves, but others without fully understanding why." Margaret's eyes flickered nervously, the truth hanging just out of reach. Miss Marple paused, considering the layers beneath the surface. There was something in Margaret's reaction that felt like more than just guilt. It was as if she were hiding something far deeper, something far more dangerous. The quiet murmur of the village, the rustle of the wind in the overgrown garden, all seemed to whisper of secrets not yet revealed. Miss Marple's mind was racing now, the puzzle pieces falling into place, each revelation adding weight to the ones before it. But it wasn't just about the Whitakers. No, this was about something far greater. The village itself had been complicit in its silence, its complicity rooted in the very heart of its history. As Miss Marple walked away, her steps sure and deliberate, she knew the time had come to expose the truth that had been buried in the dark corners of St. Mary Me. The night was deep, and with it the secrets of the past waited to be uncovered, one by one. As the evening sun sank behind the jagged hills, casting a pale orange glow over the village, Miss Marple stood in the garden, her eyes narrowing in deep contemplation. The shadows of the overgrown ivy and the twisted branches seemed to echo the confusion and tension that filled the air. Every whispered word and fleeting glance had led her to this very moment. The mysteries entwined within St. Mary Me were as complex as the wild vines that crept along the walls of Whittaker Manor, each turn revealing more layers of deceit and guilt. Miss Marple's mind worked tirelessly, untangling the webs of secrets that everyone had tried so desperately to hide. The arrival at Beatrice Marmont's cottage seemed almost like a breath of fresh air compared to the suffocating atmosphere of Whittaker Manor. The cottage was a small, humble thing, nestled at the edge of the village, far removed from the grandeur and rot of the Whittaker estate. Beatrice, though outwardly calm, greeted Miss Marple with a guarded expression that quickly faltered as they sat inside, the crackling fire providing warmth against the bitter chill outside. As the conversation unfolded, Beatrice's tense posture slowly unraveled, and she confessed to receiving an anonymous letter weeks before the murder, one that warned her to stay away from Charles Whittaker. The suspicion had initially fallen on Lillian, but now, with Beatrice's words, a new possibility emerged. Lillian wasn't just protective of her newfound place in Charles's life. She was digging into his past, uncovering things that were better left forgotten. Miss Marple's sharp mind flicked through this revelation, her thoughts turning over the hidden truths that were slowly coming to light. Who else, if not Lillian, would have wanted to silence her? And why? Beatrice's revelation added a new layer to the already complicated puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that this anonymous letter held more weight than she could have imagined. As she left Beatrice's cottage, the weight of the secrets pressing down on her grew heavier. Each piece of the puzzle was falling into place, but the final picture remained elusive, shrouded in a fog of uncertainty and treachery. The village, for all its charm, was nothing more than a facade, hiding truths so dark they could destroy everything. Her next stop was the local jail, where Harold Langston awaited his fate. The man who had once been the pillar of St. Mary Me now sat, hunched and diminished, staring through the glass partition. Miss Marple watched him closely, her demeanor calm and steady, while inside, her mind raced through the tangled events. He confessed to stealing the sapphire and covering up Charles's misdeeds, but he denied the murder. Yet, there was something in his eyes, fear and desperation, that told her there was more to the story. Harold leaned in, his voice barely a whisper, and confessed that he had been coerced. Someone had promised to protect him from the consequences if he took the fall for the crimes. The intricate dance of loyalty, fear and manipulation was becoming clearer with every passing minute. But the threads that bound these characters together were far from simple. Miss Marple stood, her eyes never leaving Harold's face, knowing that this confession, like all the others, was just another piece in the elaborate puzzle. The night outside had deepened, but within the walls of St. Mary Me, the truth was beginning to take shape, its contours sharp and dangerous. The secrets once buried deep were clawing their way to the surface, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. The chill of the fading evening crept through the narrow streets of St. Mary Me. Miss Marple walked steadily, her keen eyes tracing the subtle shifts in the air, the quiet whispers of a town wrapped in secrets and half-truths. The mystery of Lillian's murder, once tangled and distant, was slowly beginning to unravel with every step she took, each revelation bringing more questions than answers. As she passed Whittaker Manor, the old stone walls seemed to murmur, as though the house itself was concealing a dark secret, a truth buried deep within the decay of time. Her thoughts raced, each thread of the puzzle now knotted tighter. Harold Langston's confession had raised the stakes. He had admitted to his role in stealing the sapphire, in covering up the scandals of the powerful, but his denial of poisoning Lillian only added to the tension. Who, then, had the motive to silence her? Who had been watching from the shadows, orchestrating the deadly game that now threatened to consume them all? As Miss Marple made her way toward the jail, the air grew heavier, the silence oppressive. Inside, Harold sat slumped, the bravado of his former self diminished, replaced by an almost childlike fear. His confession had come at a high cost, the unnamed person who had manipulated him still lurking in the dark corners of the town. Miss Marple's eyes never left his, as she pressed him for more, her voice soft but insistent. "Who was it, Harold? Who coerced you?" His eyes darted nervously, the terror in his gaze clear as he leaned in, whispering his confession with a trembling voice. "They have ways of reaching people, ways that go beyond what you can imagine," he murmured, his words trailing off into a chilling silence. Miss Marple's mind spun with the implications. Someone powerful, someone dangerous, was behind this. Someone who had the means to manipulate and control the people in this village. The search for the truth had now become a race against time, and Miss Marple was determined to win it. The village's quaint charm hid the dark undercurrents of fear and deceit, and the longer she stayed, the clearer it became. She was not just solving a murder, but uncovering a conspiracy that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. She knew the key lay within Lillian's life, within the carefully hidden details of her past. And as she entered Lillian's room once more, her sharp eyes scanning every corner, it was there that she discovered the first real clue: Lillian's journal. The discovery felt like a jolt, a shock to the system. Carefully, Miss Marple flipped through the pages, each word a revelation. The entries were filled with secrets, not just of Charles's failings, but Harold's dirty dealings, and most importantly, Lillian's own plans for leverage. The final entry, written in a tone of defiance and fear, sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. "If anything happens to me, it's no accident." The journal painted a picture of Lillian not just as a victim, but as a woman who had known the dangers she was playing with, yet had underestimated her enemies. The vagueness of her final words left a haunting gap, one that Miss Marple knew would be the key to understanding the true depth of the plot. As she sat back, the journal resting in her lap, her mind whirred with the possibilities. Lillian had confronted someone dangerous enough to silence her permanently. The mystery was no longer just about a murder, it was about power, control, and the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. As the shadows deepened outside, Miss Marple knew that the murderer was still out there, watching, waiting. The game was far from over, and the truth, though obscured for now, would eventually emerge. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it became, for the true mastermind behind it all was still lurking in the background, ready to strike again if necessary. As the last rays of the day melted into the shadows, Miss Marple stood at the threshold of Whittier Manor, the weight of everything she had uncovered pressing heavily on her shoulders. The village, with its quaint charm, had long been a sanctuary of secrets and lies, and yet it was now caught in a complex web of manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. Every moment that passed seemed to pull her deeper into a mystery that, once unraveled, would expose not just the murderer, but the fragile, often ugly truths of those involved. Miss Marple's steps were deliberate. As she moved through the grand manor, the familiar scent of aged wood and old paper filling the air, her mind churned, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that had plagued her for days. She knew that each revelation only brought more questions, and the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. Upon entering Charles Whittaker's study, she found him perched near the window, watching the fading sunlight like a man who had long ago resigned himself to a future beyond his control. He looked up at her arrival, his eyes narrowing slightly, though his expression betrayed only a flicker of apprehension. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice stiff, yet there was an underlying tremor she couldn't ignore. She wasted no time, placing the leather-bound journal of Lillian's at the center of his polished mahogany desk. "This might interest you," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable sharpness. As his gaze fell upon the journal, the color drained from his face. His hands quivered slightly as he flipped through the pages, each entry reaffirming the fears he had long tried to suppress. The journal held a mirror to his soul, exposing his deepest secrets and the lengths he had gone to maintain control. He collapsed into his chair, the facade of strength crumbling around him. "I knew she would use this against me," he confessed, his voice low and broken. "I wanted her silenced, but I never intended for this. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't kill her." Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on him, her gaze unwavering, her mind calculating. Wanting silence, and achieving permanent silence, are two different things, Mr. Whitaker, she replied softly, each word weighted with meaning. Before Charles could respond, the door opened, and Inspector Harrow entered, his face grim as he revealed a piece of new evidence. A torn note found near Lillian's body. The fingerprints on the note, Harrow confirmed, did not belong to Lillian or Harold, but to Margaret. The room seemed to freeze in that moment, as if time itself had paused to reflect on the gravity of the revelation. Charles' face twisted in confusion and disbelief. Margaret? But why? How? He stammered, turning to Miss Marple for answers. With measured calmness, Miss Marple nodded. It seems that Margaret misunderstood your intentions, she explained. Perhaps she believed she was protecting your name, but in doing so, she may have misjudged the consequences of her actions. Her loyalty, though misplaced, led her down a dangerous path. The air grew thick with tension as the truth slowly began to unfold. The group proceeded to Margaret's quarters, where the evidence was presented to her. As the weight of her actions crushed her resolve, Margaret's composed facade shattered. I did it for the family, she confessed, her voice trembling with guilt and fear. I couldn't let our name be tarnished because of her. I thought I was protecting us all. Her confession, though a relief in one sense, only deepened the tragedy of the situation. The murder was not just an isolated act of violence. It was the result of a tangled web of fear, protection and misplaced loyalty. As Inspector Harrow took Margaret into custody, Miss Marple stood alone in the manor, her thoughts somber. Justice often reveals truths we would rather not face, she murmured to herself. The case was closed, but the village, so accustomed to peace and quiet, would never be the same again. Mary Mead, with its gentle charm, had been forced to confront its darker undercurrents, and in doing so, had shown that even the most tranquil places could harbor the deepest shadows. As the last vestiges of daylight faded into the encroaching night, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the complexities of loyalty, love, and the consequences of choices made in the name of protection. She had uncovered the truth, but the path to it had been far from simple, and the scars it left would echo for years to come. As the tension in the grand salon of Whittier Manor thickened, the cold, echoing silence of the room hung heavily in the air. Miss Marple stood at the center, her composed demeanor belying the razor-sharp intensity in her eyes, as she began to untangle the knots of deception woven around the tragic death of Lillian. Her voice, steady and unyielding, reverberated against the grand portraits that lined the walls, the silent witnesses to generations of secrets now about to be uncovered. With a measured gaze, she first turned to Harold, who had confessed to theft, a confession that seemed too neatly timed, too convenient. It cast a shadow over his sincerity, as if he had become a willing scapegoat in a scheme that absolved everyone else while sacrificing himself. A noble act, perhaps, but too carefully orchestrated to be true. Her eyes then moved to Beatrice, whose fiery temper had been so conveniently blamed for the family's strife, her outbursts often overshadowing the more calculated motives lurking beneath. Miss Marple's sharp glance pierced through the layers of anger that Beatrice wore like armor, revealing it as a mere distraction, a smokescreen masking deeper, quieter treachery. She then shifted to Daniel, whose bitterness had been palpable, his resentments against Charles providing an almost too perfect alibi for a crime he had never intended. His grievances, as Miss Marple noted, were too overt, too obvious. Guilt, real guilt, preferred the shadows, not the glaring spotlight of open hostility. As the group shifted under the weight of her words, Miss Marple's gaze finally fell upon the two at the heart of it all. Charles and Margaret, siblings bound by blood, but divided by secrets. The truth, she knew, lay within the fragile balance of family loyalty, and the shadows of ambition. Margaret, always the protective sister, had more to lose than anyone, if Lillian's marriage to Charles had been allowed to flourish. It wasn't just about preserving family honor, it was about retaining control, not just over Charles, but over the very future of the estate. As Miss Marple's eyes fixed on Margaret, the tension in the room grew unbearable, each word she spoke cutting through the thick air like a blade. Margaret's hands trembled as the weight of the accusation crashed down upon her. The quiet resolve that had once defined her posture now faltered, replaced by panic and desperate defiance. "Yes," she finally whispered, breaking the silence, her voice cracking with the weight of guilt and regret. "I confronted her. I wanted to frighten her, to make her leave Charles alone. I never intended for it to go this far." Her confession unraveled the last threads of the mystery, revealing the lengths to which she had gone to protect her family's name, using foxglove extract, a harmless-seeming poison she had been experimenting with in her garden, to scare Lillian into submission. But in her desperation, her warning had turned deadly, and the woman who had once been a threat to everything she held dear, was now lying lifeless, the price of loyalty and fear. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she crumpled, her words tumbling out in a torrent of sorrow and regret. The room was heavy with the truth, and as Inspector Harrow moved in to take Margaret into custody, Miss Marple stood silently, her eyes reflecting the quiet sorrow of a truth long buried, now brought to light. The web of lies, once intricate and complex, now lay in tatters, and the cost of preserving a family's reputation had proven to be far greater than anyone could have anticipated. As the room fell into a heavy silence, Miss Marple's eyes swept across the gathered suspects, each of whom seemed to be both waiting for and dreading the truth that was about to be uncovered. Her calm demeanor betrayed no hint of the tension pulsing beneath her words, but the weight of her gaze pressed heavily on each of them. She began, her voice as steady as ever. "The time has come to unravel the tangled web that has ensnared not only those before me, but the very fabric of this family's legacy." Her words pierced the air with an intensity that caused even the hardiest of individuals to squirm. First she turned her gaze on Harold. His confession, though crafted with the noble intent of self-sacrifice, had conveniently absolved others, and painted himself as the lone culprit. But Miss Marple saw through this thin veneer of guilt. "Harold," she continued, "your crimes were real, but your confession, though seemingly noble, served only to obscure the true nature of this tragedy. It was a lie, born not from honesty but from fear, fear of what secrets you were not yet ready to face." The room shifted, eyes darting nervously as Miss Marple moved on to Beatrice, her tone softening with the careful precision of a woman who knew how to pierce through the noise. "And Miss Marchmont," she added, "your fiery temper and public confrontations with Lillian served as nothing more than smoke to cloud the true fire. Anger can blind us, can drive us to lash out, but what lies beneath the surface is far more insidious." Beatrice, who had been standing tall just moments before, seemed to shrink under Miss Marple's scrutiny, her usual bravado faltering. Next, Miss Marple's gaze locked on Daniel, whose bitterness had been all too evident throughout the investigation. "Miss Everett," she said, her voice cool yet piercing, "your animosity toward Charles was plain to see. Yet in your anger, you became a diversion. Real guilt, as you should know, doesn't crave attention. It hides in the shadows, too terrified of being exposed." With a subtle nod, she turned to face the two figures standing at the heart of this tangled drama, Charles and Margaret. "And now," she said, the weight of her words settling in like a storm cloud, "we come to you both, brother and sister, bound by blood and secrets." The stakes were high, the pressure overwhelming, and the desire to protect what is yours, Margaret, was a force that led you to desperate measures. The room was so still that the sound of a clock ticking on the wall seemed deafening. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a near whisper as she added, "Charles, your secrets, once exposed, would destroy the delicate balance you fought to preserve. But Margaret, your own need to shield him from those very secrets led you down a darker path than you could have ever imagined." Margaret's face remained an impassive mask, but Miss Marple saw through it. The guilt was written on her every line. "And so," Miss Marple concluded, her voice gaining strength, "fear drove you both to act. But fear, as always, blinds us to the true cost of our actions." Inspector Harrow stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Margaret's arm, guiding her towards the inevitable conclusion that awaited her. The truth, though hard, was now undeniable, and yet the sadness that filled the room was palpable. As Margaret was escorted away, Miss Marple's words hung in the air, Fear left unchecked will always be our undoing. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight, pressing down on each individual present. Miss Marple's keen eyes saw not just the guilt of the accused, but the collective sorrow of a family undone by its own secrets. The grandeur of Whittaker Manor, once a symbol of legacy and power, now stood as a silent testament to the price of buried truths. As the last of the shadows fell over the estate, Miss Marple made her way to the door, her task complete, though the sadness in her heart lingered. "Justice has been served," she murmured. But at what cost? As the evening sky painted the world in shades of gold and violet, she walked away from the scene of tragedy, her thoughts heavy with the understanding that some truths, though necessary, come at a price that cannot be measured in mere consequences. The village of St. Mary Mead, with all its quaint charm, would recover, but it would never be the same. And as Miss Marple cast one final glance at the fading silhouette of Whittaker Manor, she knew that while secrets might be buried for a time, they always find a way to the surface, no matter how long it takes. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy calm, its residents no longer speaking in hushed tones of scandal, but carrying with them an undercurrent of caution, as though the echoes of what had happened at Whittaker Manor still lingered in the air like a distant storm. Days turned into weeks, and yet the revelations seemed to carve themselves into the very soul of the community, shaping the lives of all those involved in ways neither they nor Miss Marple could have predicted. Charles, his name now forever tarnished by the dark secrets that had been unearthed, made the agonizing decision to leave the manor behind. At dawn, as the first rays of light caught the towering spires of the house, he drove away, his eyes flickering one last time toward the place where everything had unraveled. The village, holding its breath, watched his departure, knowing that his exit meant the end of an era, and the beginning of an uncertain future. Beatrice, her heart broken by betrayal, and longing for a love that could never be, slowly began to rebuild her life. It was a quiet recovery, marked by small victories of dignity and quiet resilience, as she stepped out from the shadows of the Whittaker family's tumultuous history. Harold, whose theft had been but a whisper beneath the crashing waves of family tragedy, faced the justice he had long avoided. His punishment was quiet but thorough, his sentence marked not by the brutality of his actions, but by his cooperation and his small part in the greater conspiracy that had brought the family to its knees. Yet it was Daniel, the one who had remained in the background of it all, whose sudden rise to wealth intrigued the village most. His inheritance from Lillian's estate made him the subject of rampant speculation and gossip, the whispers carrying a sense of anticipation. What would he do with this unexpected fortune? The question hung over the village like a promise. Amidst these changes, Miss Marple found herself once again in the comforting atmosphere of the local tea shop, the clink of cups and the soft murmur of the regulars, providing a gentle contrast to the weighty conversations that had filled the past weeks. Mrs. Hutter, ever the one to seek solace in normalcy, spoke of how the events had come to a close, but Miss Marple's steady gaze betrayed her deeper understanding. "Is it ever truly over?" she mused softly, stirring her tea as she glanced out the window, her eyes lingering on the peaceful village life outside. The truth always has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. There was something profound in her words, something that lingered, as if the resolution of this case had only stirred a deeper understanding of the fragile nature of secrets. It was here that Margaret, once the woman at the center of it all, sat in a cold, sterile police station, her facade finally crumbling. As she confessed the truth to Inspector Harrow, her voice faltering, the room seemed to close in around her. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered through trembling lips, the weight of her own actions finally sinking in. "I thought I could frighten her. I didn't mean to kill her." Her words, filled with raw guilt and the weight of a decision gone horribly wrong, hung in the air long after she fell silent. Outside, the world seemed unchanged. The village square bustled with its usual routine, children playing and elders gossiping. But Miss Marple's keen eyes saw what others did not. The subtle shift in the atmosphere, the lingering sadness that no one spoke of. As she walked past the churchyard, Her eyes fell upon the foxgloves, swaying gently in the breeze, their beauty now forever tainted by the death they had unwittingly caused. Beautiful yet deadly, she murmured, the simple flowers now holding a weight far heavier than their delicate appearance suggested. It was then that Mrs. Huttle approached, her face etched with concern, her voice quiet as she acknowledged the terrible nature of the events that had unfolded. But Miss Marple, ever the observer, knew that this was far from the end. The truth, however buried, always found its way to the surface, and the shadows that had passed over this village would continue to shape its future in ways that none could yet foresee. As the weeks unfolded, the air in St. Mary Me grew thick with the shifting tides of change, much like the season itself, transforming with an unpredictable grace. The market square, ever the pulse of the village, hummed with a rhythm that, though familiar, felt tinged with a sense of unease. The chatter about harvests and weather seemed to brush over the deeper, quieter tremors that lay beneath the surface. Old wounds, new tensions. On a crisp Sunday morning, the church bells tolled, their echoes bouncing off the cold stone walls of the ancient building. Reverend Granger, standing before the congregation, spoke of forgiveness, of pride, and of the hidden dangers that lie within unchecked ambition. His voice, though steady, carried a weight that lingered in the hearts of those who listened. Miss Marple, sitting at the back of the church, her sharp gaze tracing the lines of faces before her, noticed the absence of Charles. His departure from the manor had been quiet, almost too quiet, and the manor itself, now belonging to a new family, stood as a silent witness to the end of an era. Later, over tea at her cottage, Miss Marple shared a knowing look with Mrs. Harrell and Reverend Granger. The conversation turned inevitably to the Whittaker family's departure. Life always returns to normal, doesn't it? Mused Mrs. Harrell, her spoon clinking too forcefully in her cup, as though her hand sought to control the chaos that had unsettled them all. Miss Marple, with her usual calm, sipped her tea and replied, "Normal, yes, but some things change forever." The air seemed heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Life in St. Mary Me did seem to return to its quiet rhythm, but the ripples of recent events stretched far beyond the gossip-filled streets. In the weeks that followed, Miss Marple received letters from those whose lives had been forever altered. Beatrice, now settled in London, wrote of the peace she had found in her simple new life, away from the shadows of the past. Daniel, too, sent a postcard, his handwriting still unsteady but sincere, from a distant coastal town where he sought to escape the legacy of whispers that had clung to him like a second skin. Margaret, her punishment sealed with little fanfare, faded into the background of village gossip, a mere cautionary tale now. It was as if the village, though scarred, had learned to carry on, hiding its wounds beneath the calm of routine. Yet, even in this quiet, Miss Marple knew that the soul of St. Mary Me, like its people, would never be free of the complexity of its hidden histories. One late afternoon, as the first cool hints of autumn crept into the air, Inspector Harrow made his way to Miss Marple's cottage. He found her in the garden, tending to her roses with a care that seemed to mirror her approach to life. Methodical, precise, and always with an eye for detail. As he observed her, a sense of admiration mixed with something else, perhaps regret, settled over him. "You have a gift, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low with a mixture of reverence and resignation. Miss Marple, never one to seek praise, simply smiled. "Experience teaches patience, Inspector, and people, well, they are terribly predictable, once you understand them." As they spoke, the events of the past weighed heavily between them. The case had shaken the village to its core, but now, with the storm seemingly past, there was a quiet understanding between them, of the cost of truth, the burden of justice, and the inevitability of moving forward. As Harrow prepared to leave, Miss Marple accompanied him to his car, her steady steps in contrast to the man's own hesitations. He paused, looking back at the elderly detective with newfound respect. "St. Mary Me won't be the same without you," he admitted, his words carrying the weight of unspoken gratitude. Miss Marple stood in the fading light, her gaze lingering on the road where the past had just departed, knowing that the village, like all places touched by human hands, would always carry its secrets. With a final glance, Harrow drove away, leaving behind a village that had learned to wear its past with quiet dignity, though the undercurrents of its history would continue to ripple just beneath the surface. As dusk fell over St. Mary Me, the village exhaled a soft sigh, its streets bathed in the golden hues of twilight. The rhythm of life, ever steady yet unpredictable, unfolded once again with the steady hum of evening sounds, the faint murmur of conversation spilling from cottages, the rustle of leaves stirred by a whispering breeze, and the occasional creak of the old market square's wooden stalls as they settled into their nightly stillness. Miss Marple, with her usual grace and patience, took a leisurely stroll through the village, her sharp eyes catching details that others missed. She paused near Whitaker Manor, now alive with the vibrant energy of new owners, a young couple eager to plant the seeds of their future. The garden was already taking shape, though notably, there were no foxgloves, those haunting flowers that had once been a symbol of hidden danger. Instead, the family had chosen bright, welcoming blooms, and their laughter filled the air, an innocent melody in stark contrast to the shadows that had once clung to the manor. Miss Marple smiled softly, acknowledging that the past, no matter how painful, always gave way to new beginnings. As she continued her walk, the peaceful rhythm of the village embraced her. There was a calmness in the air, the kind that only time could bring, but deep within, the fabric of human nature still churned with its mysteries. Mysteries that Miss Marple, ever the vigilant observer, would untangle with her usual quiet precision. Later, back in her cozy cottage, the fire crackled merrily, filling the room with warmth as she settled into her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm. Outside, the village was quieting down, its gentle slumber broken only by the distant call of an owl, or the rustle of the wind through the trees. Her mind drifted through the recent events, the lies exposed, the secrets unraveled, and the fragile humanity she had come to understand so well over the years. Each person, she mused, carried within them the capacity for both light and darkness, a duality that could never truly be separated. Just as she poured herself another cup of tea, a soft knock echoed at the door, and Mrs. Hartnell entered, her presence a welcome balm. The scent of freshly baked scones filled the room, and with it a brief respite from the weight of recent tragedies. They sat in companionable silence, the unspoken understanding between them clear. It was a silence that had grown familiar over the years, one that needed no words to convey its meaning. After a while, Mrs. Hartnell left, her promises of a return soon hanging in the air like a comfortable thread, and Miss Marple was left alone once more. She gazed out the window at the night sky, where stars sparkled like silent watchers, and in that moment, she reflected on the unyielding nature of human choices, how they shaped the course of lives, for better or worse. The village of St. Mary Me, its beauty both serene and haunting, lay beneath the vast mysterious sky, its secrets still tucked away in the hearts of those who lived there. And though the tranquility of the moment seemed fragile, Miss Marple knew better. Peace was fleeting, and the ever-turning wheel of life would soon demand more of her attention, as it always did. As the fire began to die down, she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the night pressing in on all sides. But within the walls of her cottage, she was at peace, if only for a while. For in the quiet, Miss Marple knew that the next mystery was always waiting just beyond the horizon, ready to unfold.